The forbidden jungle. Veltra adjusted the scanner's frequency as the dense jungle of Zalvarin hissed with steam and low predator growls beneath the leaves. The air was thick and hot, wrapping around her like a wet blanket, making her fur cling to her armor. Her eyes scanned the terrain nervously. No sane Zalvarian ever entered this region. The jungle was called Chacaral, the Death Nest. This place was ruled by the Thraxan apex predators, towering beasts with armored scales, acid breath, and forelegs, ending in claws sharp enough to cut stone. She remembered the stories from her childhood of entire squads disappearing into this jungle without a trace. Not even bones were found, and yet the distress beacon kept blinking. The signal was human. Darren Vex, his name was. He had landed 2 cycles ago and disappeared shortly after. The council assumed he was dead. She should have ignored the signal like everyone else, but something compelled her to find out the truth. Moving deeper into the foliage, Valtra switched her goggles to thermal mode. Her heart skipped a beat. A heat signature appeared not far away, steady, warm, and very much alive. She moved silently, stepping over roots and ducking under vines until she reached a small clearing. Then she froze. There was a fire in the middle of the clearing. Around it sat a man wearing a tattered survival suit with the sleeves ripped off. His skin was tanned, his jaw rugged, and his hands stained with something dark red. He was calmly rotating a thick chunk of meat over the fire using a sharpened branch. The smell hit her instantly. It was rich, smoky, unlike anything she'd smelled before. Her stomach turned. Darren looked up and gave a small nod as if she were expected. "Hey," he said casually. "Took you long enough? You Xaverians always this slow or just cautious?" Veltra stepped forward, cautiously scanning the meat. Her eyes widened. The fibers, the color, the thickness. It was unmistakable. "That's Thraxan flesh," she said, her voice trembling. Darren shrugged and turned the meat again, letting the juices drip into the fire, making it sizzle. "Yeah. Things tried to ambush me 3 nights ago. Took me a while, but it went down." Eventually Veltra took a step back, staring at him like he was something else entirely. Killing a Thraxan was supposed to be impossible. Even elite warriors in full armor couldn't take one down alone. And here was a human roasting it like some kind of forest chicken. "How?" she asked, not out of curiosity but disbelief. Darren smiled but didn't answer right away. He tore off a piece of the meat with a makeshift knife and took a bite, chewing slowly, savoring the flavor. "Tough meat but worth the effort," he said finally. "I used its own instincts against it. They can't see heat very well. I cooled myself down and hid near a water patch, laid out a snare trap with a few shards of my crash pod." The beast didn't expect prey to fight back. Veltra felt dizzy. She had studied Thraxans all her life, read every report, but no tactic had ever worked long enough to kill one. Darren had no real weapons, no backup, and yet here he was, dining on the flesh of her world's most feared creature. "Why would you even eat it?" she asked, trying not to gag. "Because I was starving," Darren said matter-of-factly, "and because I wanted to know what makes these monsters tick. You can't understand a predator until you've tasted it, felt its weight, smelt its fear. Beasts aren't mysterious once they're food." Veltra looked around, half expecting to see more humans watching, recording, mocking her species. Fear, but there was nothing. Just Darren, the fire, and that horrible smell. She activated her bioscanner again, hoping maybe she'd made a mistake. The readings shocked her. Not 1 but 2 other Thraxan heat signatures appeared in the logs. Already dead, decomposing near the base of the jungle ridge behind her. Her throat tightened. "You killed 3 of them?" she asked, voice cracking. Darren stood slowly, stretching his arms and cracking his neck. "That's all that came from me," he said. So far, Veltra could feel her worldview crumbling. This man wasn't a soldier or a scientist. He was something else. Something dangerous. "You need to come with me," she said finally. He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "So your council can run tests. Ask me how I did it." "I already told you no," she said, "because if you stay here, something worse might come. And if you die with what you know, this planet will never understand what really happened." Darren studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Fair enough. But I'm not leaving empty-handed." He reached behind him and lifted a bone, almost the size of his leg, a jagged piece of Thraxan spine. "Trophy, let them know I was here." Veltra looked at the fire one last time, then turned away, not wanting to smell that meat again. But deep inside her something had changed. A fear perhaps, but also a strange respect behind her. Darren whispered, to himself, staring into the flames. Not the top of the food chain anymore. Are you? And the jungle stayed silent, watching. What kind of monster is Heveltra? Could not sleep that night. Even though her body begged for rest, her mind kept replaying the image of the human sitting by the fire, chewing on Thrax's flesh as if it were nothing. Her entire species had lived in fear of the Thraxan for generations, but this human had made it dinner. She lay on the upper branch of a tree not far from Darren's small camp, watching him silently through the leaves. The fire had dimmed, but he still sat there, calm, alert, occasionally sharpening his blade or adjusting his traps, like he belonged in this death-filmed jungle more than she ever could. Morning came with the loud screeches of winged scavengers circling overhead. Darren was already awake, boiling water in a carved-out stone. His movements were slow, focused. Every motion had purpose, as if he had lived on Zalvaron all his life. Veltra dropped down from the tree without making a sound, her feline instincts letting her land soft and quiet. He turned his head, slightly acknowledging her presence, but said nothing. Instead, he pointed toward a patch of ground where a trail of blood led into the dense undergrowth. And other Thraxan had come during the night, she realized, and another had died. She followed the trail with her eyes and noticed the familiar four-toed claw marks. Then something stranger. The creature had been caught in a snare, a very basic one, yet perfectly placed at the path's bottleneck, with sharpened stakes below. The human had studied their patterns, learned their movement within days, something her people had failed to do for centuries. You didn't just kill them, you planned it, she said, her voice laced with disbelief. Planning is the difference between prey and survivor, Darren replied, setting the pot aside for cooling. He reached for a dried piece of Thraxan meat and offered it to her. Again she declined, but not with the same disgust as before, more with curiosity. How could this soft-skinned being act like he was the master of this jungle, instead of the victim? Valtra crouched beside him, observing the bones near the fire. He had arranged them in a careful stack, sorted by size and shape, like he was learning from them, measuring strength versus weakness. She realized he was not only surviving, he was analyzing, improving, adapting. Her people had declared the jungle lost long ago, retreating from it, abandoning it to the beasts. But this human had entered it and turned it into his hunting ground. You're not a soldier, not one of your Terran warriors, she said carefully. Your file says you were a xenobotanist, a plant researcher. Still am, Darren said with a small grin. Plants teach patience and structure more than most animals do sometimes. I think people underestimate the roots while fearing the fangs. Valtra frowned, her claws flexing slightly. This wasn't just some accident of luck. He had lived where no one else dared to step. How many others could do the same? Was he unique, or just the first? She asked him why he came here, why he even entered the jungle when every warning screamed death. He explained that his pod had malfunctioned during atmospheric entry and crash-landed near the Thraxan nest with no way to reach the uplink towers or call for extraction. His only option was to survive. Every day was a new lesson, every night a new fight. But you could have hidden, waited, maybe sent a distress drone, she said. I did, Darren replied. It never reached orbit, and hiding never works for long out here. The jungle doesn't forget, it hunts, it tests, it waits, but it never forgives. Weakens. Veltra looked down at her own hands, wondering how many of her people had died running instead of standing their ground. Maybe they were never weak, just never prepared, never taught, like this human had been taught by the worst conditions to become something more later. That afternoon, Darren took her to a ridge overlooking the valley below. 3 Thraxan corpses were strewn across a ravine, each killed in a different way, one by pitfall, one by impalement, one strangled by woven vine trap. All simple, brutal, elegant. She watched him crouch beside the edge and sketch something in the dirt, a map of movement patterns, predator habits, kill zones, watering holes. His memory sharp and his mind always working. She had thought him a monster at first, something unnatural. Now she wasn't sure. Maybe he was exactly what nature needed to remind them that even the top predator was only as strong as its last mistake. Maybe humans were not the monsters, they were the consequences. The sun dipped low. Darren stood and stared into the canopy, his face calm but focused. Veltra followed his gaze but saw nothing. Then she noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no movement. Something else was nearby, something worse. Maybe not a Thraxan, maybe something that even Darren had not seen before. He slowly picked up his spear and whispered, without looking back, "Time to move, we're not alone anymore." Veltra didn't argue. She followed this strange human who feasted on legends and walked among nightmares, and for the first time in her life she wondered if her world had finally met a path The human's secret weapon. Darren moved like water through the jungle, slipping between roots and branches, as if he had memorized every twist of the land. Veltra followed behind her sharp alien eyes, catching movement in the trees, but nothing ever touched them. Not a vine, not an insect, not even the wind dared to whisper in their path. She had been trained in jungle tactics, yet he never once made a sound, never once lost balance. Every step was chosen with care, every breath controlled. They reached a narrow canyon where the jungle dipped into darkness, a place even Thraxans avoided. Legends said something older than time lived there, but Darren moved forward without fear. Veltra hesitated for a second, then forced herself to follow, unsure if she feared the place or the man leading her into it. She had expected him to explain something, to talk about what they were doing, but Darren only pointed to the moss on the canyon wall. It had been scrapped in long, sweeping patterns, not natural to precise. Baftra leaned closer, recognizing the markings. They were tracking symbols, Terran one's old military code, something she had only seen in archived war files. Darren had seen them too, and nodded softly like he had expected it. They here, he said, not the Thraxans, something worse. Veltra asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. Instead, he climbed up a narrow slope using vines as support. She climbed after him. Soon they reached a rocky ledge where he stopped and knelt beside a pile of bones, some small, some massive, all clean, picked down to the marrow. Veltra scanned them quickly and found signs of acid burns, weapon damage, even radiation scars. These weren't just kills, they were tests. Someone or something had been experimenting here for a long time. Darren stood and moved further into the dark cavern, a natural maze shaped by centuries of wind and erosion. At its center they found a chamber glowing faintly from bioluminescent roots. Hanging like curtains from the ceiling in the center stood a stone platform with a shattered crate, Terran metal smashed and old, with faded logos of the old Earth Exploratory Division. The crate had once held something powerful, something dangerous. Veltra touched the surface and data flowed into her visor, corrupted but readable. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a containment pod for a genetic weapon, a bioadaptive parasite, designed for infiltration and replication. Banned before full testing completed. Darren didn't look surprised. Instead, he sat on a nearby rock, pulling out a folded map from his vest. It wasn't a normal map, it was drawn by hand with different ink colors, layers of information buried in strokes and circles. He pointed to several red marks across the jungle, all in high predator zones, each one marked by the same symbol they had just seen. He told her a quiet story from Earth's shadowed history, a time when humanity had explored not to learn but to conquer. Some Terran factions had once tested forbidden tech on isolated planets, bioweapons designed to mimic local life and infiltrate ecosystems. Their tests had been wiped from public knowledge, erased after the Unification Treaty, but some missions had slipped through the cracks, and now he believed one had reached Salvaron long ago. Veltra could hardly believe it. The Thraxans, the apex beasts, they had ruled for centuries, but what if they were not natural? What if they were the result of an old Terran experiment, left unchecked, forgotten, abandoned to evolve? Darren thought it was possible, maybe even likely. He didn't defend it, he didn't deny it, he only said that nature adapts and humans had learned to do the same, even when their mistakes returned to haunt them. They left the chamber in silence, her mind racing, his expression unreadable. As they stepped back into the jungle, Veltra noticed something strange. Every bird and beast avoided them, not just Darren now, but her as well. Something had changed, something in her scent or presence perhaps. Being close to him had marked her, made her part of his path. Later that night, they sat near a new fire hidden under a thick root arch. Darren cooked quietly, not Thraxan meat this time, but native herbs and small creatures trapped earlier. Veltra didn't eat but watched every movement. Every choice he made was part of a larger pattern, a system of survival built on instinct and experience. She asked him what his secret weapon was. Not tools, not traps, not fire, but what made him different from others. Darren looked at her for a long time, then said adaptation. He said humans don't just fight to win, they change themselves to fit the world. They enter, they become the answer to whatever question nature asks. Veltra understood then why he had survived, why her own people had failed to reclaim the jungle. They had tried to dominate it while he had become part of it. The jungle had tested him, and instead of dying, he had learned to whisper in its language. She asked what he would do next. He said he was hunting the root, not the branches. If the Thraxans were born from something else, then that something might still be here, buried in shadow, hiding in silence, evolving in the dark. She didn't argue, she didn't mock, she simply nodded and said, then we hunt it together. and the jungle listened again, silent but not still. The jungle bows to the human. The morning sun broke through the canopy like golden spears, piercing the thick mist that hugged the jungle floor. Birds called in warning, and small creatures darted into shadows, but none dared come close to the human and the alien walking side by side. Valtra had never felt so alert. Every step she took was guided by Darren's silent signals. A hand raised, a tilt of the head, a crouch behind a boulder. He moved without sound, without hesitation, as if the land itself whispered to him and welcomed his presence. They were heading deeper than she had ever gone before. This part of the jungle had no name. Only legends whispered by elders, tales of a cursed ground where even the Thraxans walked with care. The roots here were thick, like veins pulsing with life and memory. The air was heavy with spores glowing faintly in green and blue, like stardust trapped in fog. Valtra felt the hairs on her arms stand upright as if something ancient watched them from beyond the vines. Darren stopped suddenly, crouching low, his eyes locked on a trail of claw marks, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. He traced the edge of one print with his finger, then pointed to the east. Silently, they turned and moved again, weaving through a maze of thorny bushes and hanging moss. Veltra's tail flicked in irritation, but she said nothing. She was learning to move like him, to breathe like him, to see the world, not through fear but through patterns. They reached a clearing where the trees opened into a dome of sunlight, revealing a massive skeleton, half buried in the earth. It was not Thraxan. It was larger, older, its bone structure unfamiliar, even to Veltra's trained eyes. Darren approached slowly, examining the remains with quiet respect. He touched the skull gently, then looked around as if waiting for an answer that never came. Veltra scanned the area and detected faint traces of radiation, something old and unstable, possibly a remnant of the forgotten Terran experiment. Darren knelt beside a nearby patch of dirt and dug with his hands, revealing fragments of metal and a shard of glass tubing. Inside it were dried traces of what once might have been genetic material, twisted and fused with alien spores. Veltra took a step back, her mind racing. This place was not just a grave. It was a lab, a hidden vault where science had played God and then walked away. He said nothing, just stood and walked toward a nearby ridge. From there they could see the jungle stretch like an endless sea, green and gold under the twin suns. Veltra realized then how far they had come, how far below the surface their understanding had fallen. This was not about predators and prey anymore. It was about origin and purpose and the consequences of forgotten ambitions. They moved again. Veltra noticed how the animals reacted to Darren. Birds flew higher, small lizards vanished from his path, even insects buzzed in different rhythms. It was not fear, it was recognition. The jungle saw him not as an intruder but as something older, something familiar, something necessary. She had never seen anything like it. No camouflage, no shield, just presence and adaptation. They entered a gorge filled with waterfalls and narrow bridges of stone. There, Darren stopped and gestured for silence ahead. The ground was torn with fresh claw marks, deep and angry. Something had passed through not long ago, and it was massive. They followed the trail until they reached a cliff overlooking a nest, a real nest, not of eggs, but of bones and fur and weapons. Hundreds of pieces gathered like trophies. In the center stood the biggest Thraxan Veltra had ever seen, scarred, horned, armored with thick black scales. It roared, once shaking the trees, then settled back into its throne of death. Darren did not move. He simply watched and whispered, not to Veltra, but to himself, learning its breathing pattern, counting its blinks, measuring the delay in its tail twitch. He was not preparing to fight, he was preparing to understand. Veltra turned to him and asked what his plan was. He looked at her and said, we wait for it to hunt, then we follow it home. They camped above the nest, hidden in a hollow tree. Veltra tried to rest, but her thoughts kept spinning. How could he remain so calm? How could he sit near death and act like it was part of the journey? Darren spoke once before sleep, saying that predators follow rules, and once you learn the rules, the fear fades. Before dawn, the giant Thraxan moved, slipping into the jungle like a ghost. Darren signaled and they followed, careful, silent, every branch, every footprint recorded in his mind, like a map being drawn in real time. Veltra kept up without needing to ask questions. She had become part of the process, part of the pattern. After hours of tracking, the trail led to an ancient cave with walls covered in vines. Darren stopped and pointed to a metallic glint half buried in the rock. Veltra pulled the vines aside, revealing an old Terran logo, half scratched away, and beneath it a symbol that made her breath catch in her throat, the same symbol from the drone. the same from the genetic pod they had found days ago. This was at the beginning the truth. Darren turned to her, his voice steady, ready to see what the jungle never wanted us to find, and they stepped inside together as the light behind them faded into silence. The ancient secret: the cave was not silent like the jungle outside. It breathed softly through vents in the stone, its walls pulsing faintly with green light, like veins under skin. Veltra walked carefully behind Darren, every instinct in her body screaming to leave, but her curiosity kept her feet. Moving forward, she scanned the area with her visor, but half the signals were distorted, flickering between heat and electromagnetic interference. This place was not just old, it was alive in a way she could not understand. Darren walked like he had seen this before his eyes, scanning the walls, reading faded markings, symbols from Earth mixed with alien script notes, written by explorers and scientists lost to history. Veltra reached out and touched a rusted panel, and suddenly her visor synced with an old Terran data stream, long buried but still pulsing with broken memories. She watched fragments play out in her eyes. Shadowy figures in white suits carrying glowing capsules, herds of strange beasts, her own people in chains standing in rows like test subjects. The truth hit her harder than any beast could. The Thraxans were not born here. They were bred, designed in this hidden lab, grown from the DNA of native creatures mixed with Terran enhancements and pushed into the wild to see what would survive. They were made to be the perfect predators, not to conquer but to test. This jungle was never a battlefield. It was a lab, and her people had been part of the experiment. Without knowing, Darren stood beside a shattered terminal, quietly placing his hand on the cold surface. He seemed unsurprised, as if he had always suspected it. He told her stories from Earth, of forgotten labs, rogue projects, black sites where science had gone too far. He said his grandfather once worked for a group that erased missions like this from public records, making sure no one ever knew what was done in the name of progress. Veltra felt her claws tremble. Her entire life had been a lie. Every elder, every scholar had warned about the jungle, as if it was a curse of nature, but it was man-made, a wound cut into the planet by outsiders who left without cleaning their mess. She turned to Darren, demanding answers, but he only pointed to a nearby chamber. Deeper into the cavern side they found a chamber shaped like a dome, its ceiling lined with decayed tech and stasis pods, broken and empty. Each pod had a number and a label, half in Terran, half in Zavarian. The mixture of languages made her heart sink. This was a joint operation. Her ancestors had helped build this place, helped unleash the Thraxans, helped bury the evidence. In the center of the room stood one last pod, still intact, glowing faintly with power. Veltra approached it slowly, her scanner reading dormant energy pulses and faint genetic activity. The creature inside was not fully grown, not fully formed. It was something new, a hybrid, more advanced than anything before. Darren stared at it with narrowed eyes, then said, "This was never about creating predators. It was about creating survivors, something that could live in any condition, dominate any ecosystem, and then vanish without trace." She asked what would happen if it woke up. He said it would finish the cycle and start again, and this time no jungle would stop it. Mind raced. Her people had sealed the jungle to protect the world, but they had done it without knowing what truly lay beneath the roots. Darren stepped forward, placing his palm on the pod interface. It reacted instantly, reading his Terran signature, unlocking data that scrolled across the walls like fire. He read it silently, then turned to her, his voice quiet. "Your council knew not all of it, but enough to keep this place hidden." She felt her legs weaken, her claws digging into the floor. Her own people had chosen silence over truth, letting the jungle grow over their shame, and now it had grown Tita. Sudden alarm echoed through the cave, a pulse from deep underground, shaking dust from the ceiling. The pod began to hum louder, its systems waking. Darren tried to shut it down, typing into the interface, but it resisted, locking him out. Veltra stepped in and used her own genetic ID, hoping her bloodline would let her in. The system recognized her and paused, but not long enough. From outside, a screech shook the cave louder than thunder, a sound neither of them had heard before. It was not Thraxan, not beast. It was something older, something born in this chamber and released into the jungle before it could be catalogued. Darren looked at Veltra and said, "It's coming back. It remembers where it was made, and it's not alone." They grabbed what supplies they could and ran through the side tunnels, the walls flickering as backup power surged through ancient veins. The jungle had hidden this place well, but now it was awake, and the final test had begun as they burst into the light outside. Veltra looked behind her once more, watching as the cave's entrance trembled the ground, breathing like lungs. The silence before the scream of something massive rising from the jungle floor. They had found the truth, but the jungle was not done with them yet. The final hunt. The jungle did not whisper now, it roared. Every leaf shook, every branch trembled as the ground itself seemed to push them forward. Darren and Veltra ran through thick vines and broken paths, dodging thorns and roots, while the distant howl of the awakened beast echoed behind them. It was not just one cry, it was a signal, a call. Something buried had returned, and it was no longer sleeping. Veltra could feel the air changing thicker, charged with tension. Every animal in the area had vanished. No movement, no sound, only the growing rhythm of something large moving through the forest, something that made even the Thraxons hide. She tried to keep up with Darren, but her mind spun with the weight of what they had discovered. They had uncovered the roots of a forgotten horror, and now the planet was bleeding. Darren moved with a hunter's precision, never looking back, only forward, each step taking them closer to the ridge he had marked days ago, a place he said could be used as a trap. Veltra had not understood then, but now she followed without question. His knowledge of the jungle had saved them before it had to save them again. They reached the ridge just as the sky darkened with storm clouds, the pressure above matching the terror below. Darren pointed to the ravine that cut through the jungle floor like a scar, the sides steep, the bottom filled with sharp rocks and tangled roots. He had prepared it earlier while Veltra slept days ago, setting snares, digging holes, masking danger with nature. Now it would be their only chance. We lure it here, we make it fall, Darren said calmly as he pulled a shard of metal from his pack, a piece of the broken pod covered in strange markings. It smells its own, it will come. Veltra stared at the bait, then at the path they would use to lead the creature. The plan was madness, but no more than anything else they had seen. She nodded without speaking, her breath steady, her claws ready. They placed the shard in the open, on a flat rock the scent would carry in the wind and bring the beast to them. The wait was short. The jungle split open with a crash as the creature appeared, not walking but crawling and shifting its body. Unlike any form she knew, it was not Thraxon. It was larger, sleeker eyes, glowing blue skin marked with strange patterns that pulsed with energy. It looked like it had been grown from the nightmares of both Earth and Zalvaron combined. It sniffed the air, found the scent, and began to move toward the ridge. Darren ran to the left, Veltra to the right, both throwing stones, making noise, drawing its attention. Every muscle in her body screamed as she leaped from tree to tree, calling out insults, anything to keep it moving. The creature roared and gave chase, slashing through trees like they were paper, but never stopping to think, never sensing the trap. It was pure instinct, pure creation, and it wanted the piece they had taken from its nest. Darren reached the trigger point and called out, now. Veltra jumped across the final gap, landing beside him. They pulled the vines that held the last support beam, and the ground gave way beneath the creature. It fell with a sound like thunder, crashing through the earth, hitting every rock on the way down until the jungle swallowed its body and the echoes faded into silence. They stood at the edge, breathing hard, watching dust rise from the pit. Veltra scanned for life signs. Nothing, no movement, no heat, just stillness. Is it over? She asked, not with hope, but with exhaustion. Aaron looked at the sky, then at the jungle, which had begun to return to its quiet rhythm, animals creeping back into view, leaves settling, rain beginning to fall. He said, I think this one was the last, but not the end. They made camp near the ravine, too tired to move to sleep. Veltra sat by the fire, staring at her claws, remembering how she had once feared stepping deep into this forest. Now she had hunted what her ancestors called death, and won not alone, not by strength, but by knowledge and trust. And sat across from her, carving something into a stone, a symbol not of earth, not of salvation, but something between. He said it was time. The truth came out. The jungle had been lied about, hidden from the people who needed to understand it. They had feared the surface, never knowing the roots were rotting. Veltra agreed they would return to the council, not as survivors, but as witnesses, and they would not let the truth sleep. Again, far below in the ravine, the body of the creature rested, broken, silent but not gone, its cells still, pulsing faintly, its memory waiting in the soil, waiting for someone else to wake it. Ogden, the jungle listened, breathing steady, for Napa. Apex has fallen. The journey back to the surface colonies was not filled with silence, it was filled with realization. Veltra walked beside Darren through the now peaceful jungle, listening to the distant sounds of life, returning birds singing, rivers flowing, trees swaying. The jungle no longer felt cursed, it felt ancient, wounded and healing. She looked at Darren, wondering how one man had changed what thousands of years had feared, how one human had turned a death sentence into a message of survival. They reached the outer barrier where Zalvarian guards stood frozen. As the two emerged covered in dirt and blood but very much alive, Darren carried a shattered Thraxan horn. Veltra held a data core from the hidden lab. Neither spoke as the guards opened the path. Both of them knew this story was not just about monsters, it was about mistakes, choices, buried truths, and the courage to face them. Inside the council hall, Veltra stood before the elders, her voice steady, her heart heavy. She told them everything. The jungle was not natural. The Thraxans were not born, they were built. The hidden lab, the genetic weapon, the pod, the truth they never wanted to believe, lay now on the table for all to see. Behind her, Darren stood silent, not defending, not accusing, just present a reminder that truth sometimes comes with fire and blood. One elder rose and shouted that humans could not be trusted. Another demanded the data be sealed. Again Darren stepped forward and asked a question. Why do you fear the truth if it brings you strength? His words hung in the air, like lightning. The room took the floor again, and said, the jungle tested us, and we failed until one who did not fear it showed us how to walk without chains, how to learn from the wild, not hide from it, how to listen instead of command, and how to survive without losing the council fell silent, and one by one the elders sat, their eyes fixed not on the human but on their own reflections caught in the mirror of history. They had ignored the world outside their walls for too long while calling themselves its guardians. That night Veltra and Darren stood atop a tower overlooking the jungle. Fires lit across the horizon as the people of Zalvron began entering the forest. Again, not with weapons, but with questions and wonder. Darren handed her a small stone carved with the symbol he had made earlier. He said, this is not a trophy. It is a memory. Let it remind your people what nearly destroyed them and what helped them. Rizaveltra asked him what he would do now. He looked at the stars and said, there are other jungles, other worlds, and maybe other mistakes that need to be found before they wake. Again she smiled and said, then the universe is lucky to have someone like you. And he replied, maybe, but luck only matters if you know how to use it. Left the next morning aboard a Terran scout ship heading for unknown coordinates. She watched the ship vanish into the clouds, then turned back to her people, ready to rebuild, ready to remember, ready to teach the next generation what it meant to stand not above the wild but beside it. The jungle remained the same, but its silence had changed. It no longer whispered fear, it carried a story. The story of a man who feasted on the apex predator, not out of power but survival. The story of a truth buried and found. The story of two worlds that faced their oldest enemy and chose to evolve. And beneath the canopy where the roots still grow deep and the old bones slept, the wind carried a message, not in words but in feeling. The apex had fallen, and something wiser had taken its place. The end.